Hello everybody, welcome back to another Celebrity Face Reading. My name is Taylor, in a bit of a temporary studio right now. I'm currently moving, but that's not going to stop me because I have a brand new series for you all called Face Off. In this series, instead of just analyzing one celebrity's physiognomy and face and whatnot to determine their personality, I will be comparing two celebrities on their physical appearance and their physiognomy and seeing who wins out on whatever metrics we're using. So today we will be looking at none other than the two main frontrunners for the 2028 presidential election. Everyone's talking about Gavin Newsom, the current governor of California and the presumptive Democratic nominee, and J.D. Vance, former senator from Ohio, protege of Peter Thiel, and current vice president under President Trump, and the presumptive Republican nominee. And so a lot of people have been going back and forth comparing and contrasting these two figures, both in terms of their policies, their personalities, how they carry themselves, and even their appearance. So I figured that I would throw my hat into the ring, take an objective look at their appearances, and see what they can tell us about their personality and who is more fit to rule, who has the mandate of heaven, and more importantly for a democracy like America, who has the mandate of the people. And with all that being said, we're going to get right into it with round one, phenotype, where we will compare the two men's ancestry and heritage as shown in their physical traits. Now starting off with J.D. Vance, he's a Scots-Irish Appalachian, and he has a face to match that. Now, J.D. Vance is brun, by and large, which is a very typical Irish, English, Scottish, peasant sort of type, very common in Appalachia. Of course, a lot of the pioneers are of that type, but he also has a very strong alpinid element too. That's why he has that broader skull, sort of shorter relative to its length, and that shorter nose. So we can just call him an alpine brun mix. Now this is a very American phenotype because, much like with Charlie Kirk, J.D. Vance's appearance combines two European types that in the wild would not meet. Alpinids are mostly restricted to the European continent, and bruns are mostly restricted to the British Isles. And so there's not really a country or region where the two naturally meet until they began immigrating to America, and especially to Appalachia. So you got a nice mix of Irish and Germans in there, and that's what created these various distinctive American looks. So J.D. Vance belongs to a very American lineage. If there is an Appalachian race, it's this. But does he belong to the lineage of leaders? And the answer is sadly no. I say this as an Appalachian myself. We're fighters, we're warriors, we're coal miners, but generally we haven't really led America or many other places. The Irish brun and German alpinid types create a lot of peasants, but not that many kings or generals. Contrast this with Gavin Newsom, who has a very, very aristocratic phenotype. He is mostly North Atlantic, shifted a little more towards the Celtic side of things, which, much like J.D. Vance's mostly brun type, is also a very distinctly British type, but he does not have that added continental element. His face is straight out of Britain, England specifically, and I would say London in particular. He just has the look of an English aristocrat, and by extension, the look of an American aristocrat. And much like how you have J.D. Vance's Irish-German pioneer look all across America, you also have Gavin Newsom's haughty aristocrat look all across America. Gavin Newsom's face just screams old money. So on this, again, very shallow and superficial metric alone, I gotta say it goes to Newsom, but only slightly in this case. They both win out by having distinctly American phenotypes that in my book make them qualified to be president, or at the very least qualified in the eyes of the American people. But I think that if we were judging only by phenotype and heritage, the average unthinking American voter would probably pick Newsom over Vance, simply because subconsciously they recognize that Newsom belongs to aristocratic patrician stock, and Vance belongs to churlish, hillbilly, peckerwood, plebeian stock. Not dissing him, alright, that's my stock as well, but we just gotta be honest here. Alright, round one, victory to Newsom. Now on to round two, where we will look at their side profiles to tell us about their temperament and inborn traits. Now Vance is a pretty pure phlegmatic. This means that he is very tolerant, enduring, he thinks, plans, and acts in the long term, and has a very slow and steady pace of energy. He's not super active or frenetic mentally, he's very slow in both thought and action. But the counterpoint is that he's very reliable and is great with that long-term stuff. He just keeps going and going and going, and very little can keep him down. But he's not completely dull either. He has some added creativity because he has that bow of melancholy there in his side profile. That sort of bow shape, that shows a bit of an added melancholic element, which means that he has a bit of sensitivity, creativity, and quickness of wit. Now, although phlegmatics are very enduring, tolerant, and think, plan, and act in the long term, they do not make for great bosses. They make for good managers because they're pretty other-directed and they're good at managing systems, but they don't really have that strong individual sense of leadership. Compare and contrast this with the most natural leader type, the pure choleric, which we can see in Gavin Newsom. This guy is an extreme choleric of the likes of George H.W. Bush or toward Donald Trump. Not even a trace of melancholy here. This means that he's willful, bossy, commanding. Like J.D. Vance and other phlegmatics, he also thinks, plans, and acts in the long term, but his energy is not slow and steady. Rather, it's much more energetic, active, and constructive. Cholerics are the builders of the world. They're positive pessimists, which means that they see the problems of the world very acutely and accurately, but this doesn't discourage them as it might for a phlegmatic. Rather, it encourages them to solve these problems. Phlegmatics and cholerics are opposites in this regard. Cholerics are positive pessimists, as I just explained, and phlegmatics, we can say, are negative optimists. They're not super active, kind of passive, but they generally believe that things will go all right, but they're not super motivated to solve things. Now, you might say, well, if J.D. Vance is a passive phlegmatic, how did he become VP? Well, I think that has less to do with him and more with his very choleric boss, Peter Thiel, which is a rabbit hole you can look into. And others might say, well, if Newsom is a choleric, problem-solving builder, why is California in the state that it is? Well, just because a choleric is in charge of something doesn't mean that his building instinct is directed towards that thing. It could be directed towards something else. I'm going to cut to the chase here and say what everyone is probably already thinking and has probably already thought about Gavin Newsom before. This guy gives really strong, greasy car salesman's vibes. He reminds me a lot of a very choleric fictional character, Patrick Bateman. And I think much like Patrick Bateman, he has a very strong facade going here where he's claiming to care about all these issues and I want to fix California, but I think he's probably more interested in enriching himself. But because he's a pure choleric, he's very, very, very good at it. So I think that when it comes to California, incompetence is not the problem with Newsom. It's either that the political corruption is so great that he can't do anything to fix it, or that his own political corruption is so great that he just doesn't care to. But if we're judging just by temperament, in this case, we have to give the round again to Newsom, and this time by a lot. If you want to pick a president, pick a choleric. A phlegmatic type is not going to cut it. Vice president, yeah. Secretary of State, maybe. Chief of Staff, Treasurer, awesome. President, heck no. All right, with that out of the way, we are now going to compare and contrast their face shapes, which will tell us about their personality archetypes and the broad strokes of their personalities. As we can see here, J.D. Vance actually has an interesting combination face shape. It's mostly Earth, mostly square there, which stands for the businessman archetype. So that means that he's very practical, material, concerned with loyalty and family, very down to earth and grounded, not given to flights of fancy. But in addition to that, he also has a subtle reverse trapezoid shape. This is the Jupiter face shape, and it stands for the judge archetype. This means that in addition to all those earthy traits, he is also quite judgmental, outgoing, gregarious, generous, generally given to being quite religious, especially in a very public-facing, organized religion sort of way. He's very, very concerned with justice and righteousness. Not so much internal spiritual morality and conviction, but more so with making the world right, just, and orderly. This combination Earth and Jupiter face shape gives us a unique hybrid archetype that I like to call the regulator, where they're concerned with law and justice like the Jupiter face shape, but they're also very meticulous, orderly, and given towards loyalty and creating these structures of order and pragmatism like an Earth face. Now this very short and square face contrasts heavily with Newsom's very long, thin, and pointy face. I would say that he has a pure Mercury face shape. That's that triangle shaped face, and that stands for the magician archetype. Some might look at it and say it's a more Saturn face shape, but I think that's a persistent optical illusion that can be created when a pure choleric has a Mercury face shape, since the Saturn face is a naturally choleric personality and fits the choleric temperament better. But for whatever reason, Newsom doesn't really have that face personality. He's a Mercury. That means that he is quite sensitive, reactive, very witty, improvises, and thinks well on his feet. He really wants attention and adulation and approval of others. He's very other-directed in that sense. And to think back to his wit, Mercury was the god of communication, so the Mercury face shapes are great communicators. A lot of actors, singers, and comedians have this face shape, as well as a lot of political pundits. Again, think back to the slimy used car salesman thing, even down to the slicked back hair. I think that's the reason why he gives those vibes to people. He doesn't have the face really of a leader. He has the face of a communicator, a salesman, a con man even. And so when it comes to the face shapes and archetypes, we gotta give it to Vance 100%. His face shape, his archetype, that regulator, it's much more suited for government. Maybe not exactly the presidency, but if it's a choice between him, who's more of this background, better in the Senate, maybe better in the Treasury or the vice presidency or something like that, than the presidency, even that is preferable to the pure communicator, media-focused, image-focused, doesn't care about the actual policies, just about his own image and how his campaign is going. That sort of Mercury face that you see in Newsom, that is going to bring out the worst aspects of American politics, so we can't have that. All right, so the score so far, Newsom 2, Vance 1. It's anyone's game at this point. Before we go into the final round where we will compare their facial features, we're going to first look at the facial features they share, because there are quite a few interesting ones here. They contrasted very heavily so far in phenotype, temperament, and face shape, but when you get to the facial features, you start to see some similarities. They both have small, deep-set eyes, little beady eyes. This means that they're cynical, untrusting, and they think a lot before they speak. They're very calculated. They don't speak off the cuff or from the heart. In keeping with this communication style, they also have quite small mouths, which means that they're both naturally quiet and reserved. Again, their communication and their public appearances are all very calculated. These are natural introverts. They also both have close-set ears, which means that they're not very independent. They're very reliant and dependent on their social networks and their connections. With Newsom, this is obviously the DNC establishment and the California political machine. And for Vance, this is obviously the Peter Thiel, Silicon Valley, CIA nexus of power that has backed him consistently. And speaking of both their ears and their introversion, look at the space between their tragus and their antitragus in their ears. It's very small, which shows, again, introversion and a lack of natural off-the-cuff speaking ability. Now, how do they compensate for this? By practicing, by rehearsing. They both have a big laundry list of canned talking points that their interns or someone else have cultivated for them. You can especially see this in Newsom. Whenever Newsom does his charismatic good speaking that people like to talk about, it's just an Obama impression. The guy's just trying to be white Obama, and you just gotta look at him and tell him, bro, you are not him. You are not from Chi-Town. You are from San Francisco, dude. What's your Obama impression gonna be? Let me be queer. Just stop, bro. Final note is that both of them have pointy tips of the nose. This means that they are naturally mean people. They're not very nice in their personal lives. They're pretty miserly and harsh. Now, personally, I think that that is actually a good trait to have on a president and a politician in general. I think back to what my dad said about Trump in 2016. You're not voting for pastor, you're voting for president. And part of the job description for any leader, whether it's a king, an emperor, or a president, is that you have to do harsh, cruel, or even awful, evil things for the sake of your people. I believe it was Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who said, I don't care if I go to hell as long as my people get to live in paradise. But in any case, these are all features of very calculated career politicians. These are not features of inspiring, bold leaders. So right now, it's not looking really good for either of them, but we're going to see if either of them can snatch victory from the jaws of defeat in this final round, where we will compare and contrast their dissimilar facial features. Newsom's eyebrows are arched, showing that he's competitive and has a strong need for control and being in charge, but they're rather thin, which shows that he's losing energy. Contrast this with Vance's nice, thick, Appalachian eyebrows like mine. Those straight eyebrows means that he's a logical thinker and that he's stubborn, and the thickness shows intense energy and stamina. Winner here is clearly Vance. Newsom has those competitive mercurial eyebrows, but they're just too thin. He's not built for it. He's getting drained. It's got to go to Vance for this. He's got the stamina. Now we'll go to the eyes. Again, they're both deep set. They both have kind of that beady look to them. Newsom's eyes are much more intense and aggressive. He has a much more expressive gaze. Contrast this with Vance's, which are much more passive. He has a negative canthal tilt. They look much more like nice guy kind of eyes. I think it's got to go to Newsom in this regard, both in terms of electability, because Newsom's look a lot more charismatic and compelling to the average dumb voter, and also in terms of leadership, because I think Newsom's indicate that sort of intensity and energy that you need in a president, versus Vance's very passive, phlegmatic, other-directed energy. And we're going to keep moving down and look at their noses. Newsom's nose is beaked or convex. It's not a true Roman nose. That means that he has a lot of deep passions and sensitivity deep down. It's very long, which means that he prefers thought to action. Maybe a reason why California is in the state that it's in. He's more focused on campaigning and planning his next presidential run than he is in actually fixing the state, but that's just speculation. And he's got long nostrils, which show an intellectual disposition. Now, you couldn't find a sharper contrast than with Vance's nose. People talk about the white race. Brother, these guys are not the same race. Look at those noses. Vance's nose is very short, which means that he's very action-oriented, very impulsive, spontaneous, and it's straight rather than beaked, which means that he has a cool-headed, rational disposition. But he's got a real narrow bridge of the nose, which stands for sensitivity and reactivity and a bit of a lack of stamina. So it's kind of balancing out those eyebrows there, I think. And he's got round nostrils, which stand for a sensual and romantic disposition. So as for the nose, we got to give it to Newsom. He has a much more thoughtful and leaderly nose, a much more aristocratic nose, versus Vance's nose, which is much better suited on a farmer, a soldier, a salesman, something like that, not the leader of the free world. Finally, we're going to look at their mouths. They're pretty similar, again, they're both pretty small, but Newsom has really thin lips, especially his lower lip. That's the really freaky part, because the upper lip stands for communication and relation with the outside world. The lower lip stands for your communication with yourself, your connection with your inner world of thoughts, feelings, morals, and desires, your sense of self. Now, most people have a thinner upper lip than their lower lip, and a stronger conception of how they are internally than they do expressing that to other people. With Newsom, it seems like it's the opposite. It seems like he's better at expressing himself to other people than he is at actually taking account of himself and soul-searching. To go back to Patrick Bateman again, I'm reminded of that quote, "You can shake my hand and imagine that our lifestyles are probably comparable, but there is no real me." And I feel like that might apply to Newsom with that thin lower lip. He genuinely might be an actual NPC in a suit with a handsome face, just walking around repeating lines. I don't know. Contrast this with Vance, who has a much more normal mouth. He has fuller lips. That shows that he's more in touch with himself, and he's a more open communicator. So you can trust him to be at least a little more honest than Newsom. As for the mouth, the winner is Vance, leaving us broadly at a tie. Neither one stands out as particularly better than the other. They both have advantages and disadvantages. But in general, my verdict is that I don't think either of these men are favored by either the mandate of heaven or by the American people. Again, they're very dissimilar, but where they do overlap, it's in things that people generally find unsavory. And I think that although they are very different from each other, they each specialize into aspects of politics that are not great in a president. Newsom with the whole slimy, slick-haired, smooth-talking, empty suit kind of vibe that he has, just the show politician who's just there to put a face to a political machine. And Vance with his weird, chud, peasant sort of look. People look at him and they think, oh, he seems like a nice guy, he seems like a good guy, someone I'd want to have a beer with or a pizza with. But that's not what gets a president elected. Donald Trump understood this when he ran in 2016. All the other Republican politicians were coming in just the button-up shirt, no tie or jacket, and eating the pizza and going to the shop and oh, a butter cow. Trump knew that people vote for someone who is above them. They don't want to relate to the president. They want the president to have riz, to have aura, to be a god standing above them. Reagan understood this as well. He said there has to be a certain decorum around the presidency. You have to wear the suit, you have to look nice, you have to be composed, you have to seem like you're better than other people. Newsom has this, but he's just too slimy, too sleazy, too evil. People can smell that from a mile away and they just don't buy it. What you need is someone with Newsom's aristocratic look, nature, and pedigree, his composure, his posture, his well-spokenness, his vibes, his nice suits, combined with J.D. Vance's authenticity, credibility, and relatability. Even people who hate him can't really say that he's an evil or bad guy. They just say that he's a puppet of other interests. But if I had to pick one that I think would probably be more likely to be president, I would say probably Newsom if we're just going on physiognomy and phenotype alone, just because he has more of that aristocratic look. And clearly, history does not really care that much of how good of a person you are, so much as how adept at playing the political game you are. And when it comes to that, Newsom seems like one of America's top Machiavellians. So the winner of our first physiognomy face-off is Gavin Newsom. Disclaimer, this is not an endorsement of Gavin Newsom. I don't like the guy. I don't vote. I'm not allowed to vote because I'm a convicted felon. That's a joke. But he's my choice if I had to pick one who is better suited for the presidency. Not looking at his policies or anything, but just him as a person. But in any case, I hope you enjoyed this celebrity face reading, our first face-off. Give me suggestions in the comments for which celebrity face reading you want me to do next, especially which celebrity face-off you want me to do next. Do you want me to do Netanyahu versus Khamenei, Trump versus Putin? Who's it gonna be? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to learn more about this topic or get a face reading done for yourself or someone you know, message me on my website. Link is in the description. You can also find a link to my Patreon where I upload bonus videos where I explain all of this stuff and the basics of physiognomy and phenotypes to you so you can become as much of an expert as I am. This has been Taylor from Prosopa Insights reminding you to always judge a book by its cover. Thank you for watching.